Good evening, everyone. My name is David Ansara. Welcome to the Free Market Foundation. This event forms part of our series of ongoing events looking at public policy issues, questions of ideology, and matters of public interest in terms of current affairs. And it's very important for us to have these in-person interactions. This month's event is very special. We're joined by Hügo Krüger. Is that the correct pronunciation? Krüger, yeah. He is South African born, but he actually lives in Paris, in France, where he practices as a civil and nuclear engineer. And he is a multifaceted Renaissance man, if you will. He's a podcaster, a writer. He knows a lot about nuclear energy and technology, and has worked in the sector as well. He's worked on a variety of energy-related infrastructure projects, ranging from nuclear power, liquid natural gas, and renewable technologies. And he's also a weekly columnist for the IOL on energy-related matters. And Hügo is going to be speaking to us about the future of nuclear energy, particularly in the South African context. And some of the key questions that we have asked Hügo to explore in his presentation is why does nuclear energy have such a bad name? So we'll be looking at some of the risks and the reputational issues that follow nuclear energy. We'll be comparing nuclear energy against other energy sources, so fossil fuels and renewables. We'll also be looking at new technological developments. So one of the discussion points is from pressurized water reactors to advanced reactors. And Hügo will enlighten us about some of these new technologies. And then we'll also be speaking about the context of the electricity crisis, the energy crisis in South Africa, and could nuclear play a meaningful role in alleviating that crisis. And then we'll also be discussing and exploring political and regulatory obstacles to nuclear energy and looking at the road ahead. So Hügo was originally going to do a webinar from Paris, but for personal reasons he was out in South Africa. So we very hastily arranged this event. So I'm apologetic for the short notice, but very grateful that you could all join us tonight. I should stress that we provide this platform in the interest of a robust debate. The views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Free Market Foundation, but we find it important to give a platform for those views and to have a robust discussion around those. But without further ado, Hügo, over to you.
Right, thank you, David. So I'm just I put the title here as the future of nuclear energy. And there's a lot of people who have already predicted the past of nuclear energy. So I'm sort of going to try and give you an assessment of what's going on in the industry. There's good and bad happening at the moment. And I think anyone who oversells you something is not being totally honest. And there's a lot of, the first thing to understand about the energy sector, I've worked on all projects. Okay, so I've worked in oil and gas, I've worked on offshore wind, I've worked in nuclear energy. I haven't worked in solar, but I've got a good sense of what's going on there. Everyone is trying to sell you something. And as any good salesman, I was a hardware salesman before I became an engineer, you always give 5 upsides and only 1 downside, okay? So all these technologies, including renewables, have a place in the world, and they all do work, and they're all under certain conditions. Like any technology is a tool, and nuclear is also a tool. It's got limitations, but it's got great applications as well. And I'm sort of going to discuss all of it. So just my quick background here. I studied at Turkish University of Pretoria. Then I went, I actually first worked in South Africa for Lafarge in cement and fly ash technology. So I got to learn the coal industry as well a little bit from that perspective. And then I did my master's in civil nuclear engineering from the École Spéciale de Travaux Publics in Paris. And then afterwards I worked on Hinkley Point C, which is a very expensive project in the UK. It's a lot in the news. You will hear all the bad people cite that one. Then I worked at ITER, which is International International Thermonuclear Reactor, which is a fusion reactor, where they have got what we call magnetic confinement. And I designed one of the building. I worked on the design team. Nobody ever designs nuclear. It's always a team. I worked on the team where we designed the assembly preparation building for that big magnets before they go into operation. And then I worked in the oil and gas industry in the last 5 years and in offshore wind. And many of you won't be surprised to know that the oil and gas industry also invests into renewable energies. Okay, it's not a threat to their interest, as is commonly asserted. The concept of oil company no longer really exists in my view. They are all called energy companies. It's Total Energies, BP Energies. Exxon is the only one that is still a little bit hesitant. But even they have gone into renewables because there are sensible investment opportunities there. Then just on the sideline, I have a Substack article. I do a podcast on YouTube, and I write a new title, IOL column, which is now titled Engineering Descent, where I try and explore it. And then I'm married to an Iranian woman, and as you know, nuclear in Iran is quite a hot topic. There's a lot of propaganda involved in that issue, and I've been to Iran twice. I have not been arrested by the Secret Service yet, so I've survived that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to start here with basic concepts for those who are not necessarily, who don't have a physical background. You'll hear a lot about energy and power particularly, and it's always confused. Energy is defined in physics as the capacity for work. Okay, I can push a lot. I can do a lot of. I can spend a lot of energy, but I don't do a lot of work. Okay, that's all we can offer that. It's defined in the units of Newton times meter. It's a force displaced. Power is the rate of energy. When we talk about a power station capacity, that's usually in power. Okay, and the media will always confuse these two. I don't know why. And then we talk about energy generation, thermal generation. That is, again, watt-seconds. It's, again, the same unit as energy. So if a turbine works, it's the same unit as when a man works. Right? Energy is in joules. Then there's also a concept of just thermal energy and electrical energy. So in a nuclear power plant, we basically heat water. It's the same in a coal power station. And roughly 2/3 of all energy is lost in the process. Okay, then the efficiency of a turbine or a power station is measured as the ratio of the cold temperature of the water coming out divided by the hot temperature. So if you have very hot temperature, if you increase the temperature on one side or you decrease it on the other side, you increase the efficiency. Okay, and that's the equivalent to the energy loss in the system. And many of you have probably heard of the nanowatt revolution, which is energy efficiency. They try to reduce that factor or increase the factor to 1. So the more efficient it becomes, the less energy you lose in the system. And that is the argument that the renewable group will throw at you. So just basics of nuclear power, there's 3 concepts to know. You've got a fuel, that's generally uranium. It's low enriched uranium. You get something called MOX fuels, you have thorium. You have a moderator, graphite, heavy water, light water. And the purpose of the moderator is to slow down the fast neutrons so that a chain reaction can become more likely. So basically you have enriched uranium and water. The water slows down the neutrons and that occurs to chain reaction. And that is your heat source. Okay, and then you have a coolant. Water is a dual purpose where it is both a moderator and a coolant. It can also be salt, also be gas, and then I add salt here, molten salt. People will speculate, if I'm using the right term here, but I'll get later to why it is. And then just around the reactor, you've got a reactor, which is generally steel, and then you have a containment building, which is generally concrete. Okay, reactor vessel and a containment building. The pressurized water reactor, boiling water reactors, and the pressurized heavy water reactor. These are the only reactors that are in commercial operation around the world. Most of the reactors around the world are pressurized water reactors, PWRs. Coburg is a good example of that, for example. Canada and India are into heavy water reactors. The difference is heavy water is a better moderator, and you can use natural uranium and not enriched uranium. And then you have a boiling water reactor, which I think 35% of the United States' nuclear plants, something like that, uses a boiling water reactor. Then I'm just quickly giving a lesson to economics, but it shouldn't be. I'm actually teaching a bunch of economists economics here, so excuse if I get things wrong. But there's a very good economist that I follow quite closely who is called Sir Anthony Wrigley. And he wrote here a very interesting book called Energy and the English Industrial Revolution. And I always recommend this book for anyone who's interested in both engineering and economics. And he came to critique modern economic theory, and especially Adam Smith. And I know Adam Smith might be popular over his work a little bit, where he said Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus in the 17th century thought in terms of the relationships of land, labor, and capital. Okay, and land is finite. You cannot increase land, and therefore land is the basis of all property rights, basis of constitutions, the basis of free markets. And generally, economists would say without property rights, you cannot have wealth. Now, I'm not disputing any of that. I think that's a very valid argument. But Anthony Wrigley said that the mainstream economic theory in the West had an issue, which is they never understood the role of energy. Energy being the capacity of work. And if you look at Italy and England in the 1800s, they were more or less equally in terms of democracy. There were subtle differences, so was the Netherlands. But England took out into the stratosphere with economic growth. And that was mainly due to the discovery of coal, because coal was located in shallow deposits, where, in contrast, if you go to Limburg and Sardinia, very deep below the surface, you find the coal deposits are deep. So he coined the term organic societies. These are societies without basically coal, who has not exploited fossil fuels yet. And he made a point that they will have limits to growth. Now, limits to growth is not the Club of Rome. He just said that their development was constrained until they discovered the disruptive technology of fossil fuels. And that's why fossil fuels today is still the backbone of the industrial economy, even though some people would like to deny that. Then I just want to introduce you to the nuclear conundrum. Nuclear power advocates will always tell you that nuclear has got the lowest land usage, and it's got the highest amount of energy per gram or per kilogram, energy density, land density. But then the question is, even though there's a physical and engineering case, does that necessarily mean that there's a business case? Does it mean that because I've got energy density, the cost is always, it's going to be the best cost? Now, if you think in terms of corn yields or in terms of food, for example, food would be a better example. The amount of protein content does not measure the price you pay at the restaurant. You've got services, you've got other types of factors going into that thing. So it's not necessarily true that the energy density would give you the most efficient source. Nuclear advocates don't always like to admit it. It doesn't mean nuclear doesn't have a business case, just putting it out there. Engineers have a bad intuitive sense of energy density. Economists, I think, have got it right. They ask, how much does it cost? Okay, and that's a very important question to ask here. How do we compare technologies? This is something called the levelized cost of electricity. It is criticized a lot, depending on what energy source you sell. There's other metrics such as the integration cost, the downtime, the full cost of electricity. I'm not going to delve in them tonight, but just to take a little bit of what I take with a pinch of salt. But basically, the levelized cost says how much does that plant cost over its lifetime divided by the amount of electricity. Okay, and what is the amount of dollar per megawatt that I've got? And in terms of nuclear, it's highly influenced by two factors, which is the discount rates and the capital expenditure. So how much money for the plant? These are big, large plants. Lots of things can go wrong. It's a high-risk investment. It's high-risk, high-return investment. That's how you need to think of it. And then the discount rate, the interest rate of the bank, highly influences the levelized cost of electricity. At a 3% discount rate, nuclear has got a business case. Higher than 3%, it does not have one. Okay, so if you don't have a low interest rate environment, forget about nuclear power. That's what I would say. If you have one, do consider it. Okay, so that's one of the conditions for nuclear. Then, why does nuclear energy have such a bad name? Now, let's look at the United States of America. Vogtle Power Station is probably the most expensive power plant in human history. It's cost $30 billion for 2.3 gigawatts of electricity. Gigawatt is 10 to the power 9. And it comes down to about $13,000 per kilowatt of electricity. Okay, France have recently built the Hinkley Point 10,000. They've managed to get Flamanville inside France at 8,000, and they're actually building more affordable in Finland. It's something between 6,000 and 7,000, depending on the source you've got. So France is in the export market for 7,000. It's still expensive. Okay, but then we go to the east. We look at China. China's coming in at 3,000. Okay. If you take into account the Americans are at 13,000, the Chinese are building at one-fifth, one-sixth of the cost almost as the United States. Russia, they're building at 6,000. There's a lot of hype about Russia in the export market. Russia generally was only exporting over land, historically speaking. They've built their first one in Egypt overseas, and they're having a little bit of issues with costs as well, but there's good signs that Russia might get it under control. Now, that doesn't validate Vladimir Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. I'm just saying the Russians have a good business model, but the state will probably absorb some of the costs of the Egyptian plant. South Korea, a remarkable project built in Dubai. built by 150 South Africans on the site. The first one done on time in years. It was built in 5 years, and then there was a 2-year delay of COVID, 7 years. Delay was not due to construction, it was due to not having people trained fast enough. Okay, and they're coming at 4,000. Then India, I put India here. India is not yet into the export market, but the Indians have managed to make their own version of Canada's can-do reactor, and they're building at $1,800 per kilowatt of electricity. And they're building at mass production at the moment. So definitely there is a business case for nuclear if you buy it from the right country. Okay, but the Western countries have lost their niche. France might be back in the game with the EPR2. I might work on that project, so I'll let you know if it's a success. But at the moment for South Africa, I would say neither France nor the United States is a proper option based on cost alone. Okay. Then I just want to point something out about the Russian cost. Activists ran to the media at the time and said it cost $1 trillion. Based on these calculations, it was $600 million. The $1 trillion Zuma deal, I cannot find any evidence of that. Okay, not at the Zondo Commission. I've been looking. I'd be willing to be proven wrong. I've read the court case. It does not sound to me like a judge got it correct. So Jacob Zuma has done a lot of wrong things, but I don't think on nuclear power, at least I have not seen any evidence that there was something wrong. And I'll get now into the activism against nuclear a bit later. So just a, sort of a summary there. There's a claim nuclear costs too much. That is true if you buy from 2 countries, the United States and France. It is not true if you buy from South Korea, from Russia, or from China in the export market, and soon to be India. And even Japan is now going to, they're building at a very affordable cost, historically speaking. They're not in the export market, though. Okay, there's 3 numbers to remember in nuclear: 10,000, 6,000, and 3,000. 10,000 is at the top of the S-curve. 6,000 is you're building your second plant, and 3,000 your third one. You need 3 plants to hit mass production. So if you buy from a country, ask if they've built 3 plants in a recent history. That's generally speaking where you buy from. So why does it have a bad name? So let's look at Western countries. Historically, they built at $3,000 per kilowatt of electricity. Historically, they built. And then here's something after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl occurred, where the cost just exploded due to regulation. Unfortunately, I'm speaking with free market activists. It's not heresy to criticize regulation and safety here. Okay, but they try and do that in a nuclear platform. So just to say you a private investor's point of view of nuclear historically built were utilities, government-to-government transactions. They might, in the United States, it was a bit different. They were private investors. But even the United States, if you look carefully, eventually the state stepped in a little bit. So that's always a question that private investors would ask you. And the reason for this is you take 5 to 7 years to get your money back. That's how long it takes to finish the plant. And then you break even after 15 years. No private investor really wants that return. If you compare that against just putting my money at the bank or in the market, it's 7 times lower risk. It doesn't mean you don't get high risk is high return, but the private investor is taking a high risk with this type of investment. A government might not, under condition they buy it from the right people. Okay. Then major nuclear plants in the United States expanded before the 1973 oil crisis. Since the 1973 oil crisis, in the period of deregulation, nuclear in the United States has not really recovered. They've now finished their first plant really in Vogtle in America, but I believe if the United States removes subsidies today, something like 70% of their nuclear plants will be out of business. Okay, that's just a fact. However, in France and Spain, they went the other direction. They had a mass build program. Iran is now soon going to have a mass build program. Russia is going to systematically rebuild and replace their coal stations. China is having a mass build program. So you have mass build programs going on. But in the United States, given the regulations, given the activism, they've never allowed economies of scale to take place again. You need 3 plants, and if you rebuild every 10 to 15 years, you start at the top of the S-curve. So there's clearly a problem in the political economy. Okay, how fast can nuclear be deployed compared to renewables? Well, if you look at historical evidence, nuclear, if it hits mass production, is much faster than any renewable. In fact, I don't believe there's any large industrial economy that is totally fossil fuel free in terms of electricity generation. In terms of energy generation, the entire economy, even France gets half of its energy from fossil fuels. Okay, France, which has got the highest nuclear in the world. So the people who wish away fossil fuels, I've got bad news for them. It's going to be here till the end of the century. We just have to accept a warmer planet. I'm here in defense of what is a base loader. This is now a derogative term that has been thrown around, particularly by the University of Cape Town. They say people who believe in nuclear believe in base load capacity. And I take here the 2 flagship cases for renewable energy. which is California, and South Australia. South Australia is probably the best in terms of renewable energy. And if you look carefully, natural gas still dominates California's energy mix. They have to use natural gas to counter the intermittency of renewables, even with the expansion of batteries. Batteries are not there yet. Okay, and if you look closely at the bottom, they've got nuclear power in California. They can probably replace a lot of that gas with nuclear power if they keep on building, but they've got a law in California apparently, or ban on it, against new nuclear power. So there's a complete Luddite attitude to it. South Australia's got a bit of a better case when the wind blows strongly. Then they've got a few days. There's also a renewable activist on Twitter who said they had 106% renewables at 1 p.m. and then they were down to 4% during peak time. Now, this is if you're down at 4%, I ask, what are you doing during that period? And you find South Australia still remains dependent on natural gas and imports from its neighbours, which is either hydropower or coal. Australia is like South Africa. It's a coal country. Okay, coal will be here also for a very long time. That's my belief. Coal under certain conditions can actually outperform natural gas. If we're honest about the facts. So let's just look at nuclear energy versus other sources quickly. With one plant, United Arab Emirates, that plant that I would say that we can be proud that 150 South Africans work there, were part of the team. They added more capacity to the grid than than Portugal and Denmark respectively did in almost 20 years. Okay, with just one plant. So clearly there's a high risk, high return. But you can see the return here. You build one plant, the UAE is going to build another one. So they're basically going to do what one country did in 20 years, in 7 years, or in 10 years. And if they hit mass production, you can decarbonize potentially electricity system. So I'm going to quickly get you to regulatory reform, and this is radiophobia. Why did the costs explode in the United States and France? Okay. This is a cartoon given to me by Dr. Richard Lindzen, who's been opposing fear in climate alarm for a very long time. And it's as relevant of that story as of COVID and as all things we cannot see as of nuclear power. You have what we call the iron triangle and the rice ball. Okay, so scientists make meaningless or ambiguous statements. The advocates and the media translate the statements into alarmist declarations. And then the politicians respond to the alarm by feeding scientists more money. And then they go on and on and on. And the more money for research, the more fear, the more data, the more scare story. And the problem we find here is two things. One is fear, and the second one is innumeracy. People don't deal with numbers. Okay, so if I tell you 1,000 people died of COVID in a month, it sounds like a lot. But if I tell you 1,000 people die every day in South Africa, it's not the end of the world, for example. So we don't know how to deal with risk. And here you find examples of this in the media. Japan is going to release radioactive water. It contains tritium. Tritium is an isotope of water. You find it naturally. There's nothing wrong. China releases more tritium from their nuclear plants normally in a few days than Japan will from dumping that water in the ocean. Yet you look at the media, they cite scary words, but is it safe? There's 100 tanks. Is it enough to fill 500 Olympic swimming pools? And they make all of these statements with numbers, and it sounds scary. And now the politicians are saying, but we need more safety, we need more evaluations. You get to a point where the scientists and the engineers don't know what to say to the public anymore because of the fear-mongering. And this, in my view, is the principal reason why costs have exploded in the United States and France. So this was written by Dr. Patrick Moore, who was the founder of Greenpeace, where he said at the height of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the threat of all-out nuclear war, and a newly emerging consciousness of the environmentalist, I was transformed into a radical environmental activist. Okay. While doing my PhD in ecology in 1971, I joined a group of activists who had began to meet in the basement of the Unitarian church to plan to protest the voyage against the hydrogen bomb testing. It's important to notice that the modern environmental movement did not start protesting fossil fuels. They protested nuclear testing. Now, I personally am against nuclear weapons for a variety of reasons. I believe South Africa, by signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, set a good example for the world. But confusing nuclear weapons with civilian nuclear power is fundamentally dishonest. There are 33 countries with civilian nuclear powers, and I think only 6, if I remember correctly, South Africa was the 7th who has nuclear weapons, and one of them, Israel, has nuclear weapons, but they don't even have civilian power, and they haven't even signed a Non-Proliferation Treaty. Okay, and the same goes for the United States, who hasn't signed. Countries who haven't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty are facing population pressure of fear. And I think that would be one step from the nuclear industry into the right direction. is for countries to get rid of the weapons. For 10 years, something like 10% of all energy in the United States came from repurposed nuclear warheads. There's no reason for them. I don't believe they are deterrents in warfare. They did not stop the Russian-Ukraine war. You're completely useless. Now, Oliver Stone's recent film, I recommend Nuclear Now. He digs into it. I also did an interview of Andy May titled Greenpeace's Crimes and Lies, and I make no excuse to calling Greenpeace a criminal organization. They've been banned twice in New Zealand from registration, okay? And they're banned in India at the moment, and they found it admitted to using propaganda to influence public opinion. Then the activists, the annual opponents of nuclear power, they get about $2.3 billion. These are the organizations. That's the cost of finalizing the pebble bed, by the way. That's what they get in 1 year. Okay, so that's a lot of money going into activism. Not all that money will probably go for anti-nuclear, but they have anti-nuclear statements. They're by and large broad environmental groups. So you're faced with this thing. So to elaborate a little bit on radiation and radiophobia, you have what is called, there's two units of radiation that just communicate, Becquerel and Sieverts. Becquerel is the atomic nucleus decay per second. It's a more concentrated unit, and Sievert is a more full body exposure type of unit. Okay, so it's a more broader sense. Doesn't matter which one you use, you get to the right answer. Sievert is 1 joule per kilogram. Okay, and Sievert represents the equivalent biological effect of a deposit of dual radiation on human tissue. So it's just human tissue, and if you absorb it, I believe it's called gray. Then I actually want to commend the Free Market Foundation for being one of the first organizations to criticize what I'm going to say now, which was an article by your former CEO, Leon Low and Bon Posma on the linear no threshold model of radiation, where they questioned also the straight line graph that formulates radiation safety policy. And there's an excellent book here by Dr. Wade Allison, who at Oxford, who taught health physics at Oxford, where he's questioned the same thing from a more medical perspective. There are other people as well. And this is what I would say is the underlying dogma of radiation fear. That's the assumption that all radiation is dangerous, no matter the dosage. That's just blatantly absurd because a banana is radioactive. So many things are radioactive, and you don't get cancer from them. But yet that is the modern radiation safety standards. So let's look at the claims of radiophobia. First of all, if you look at Chernobyl, there's a lot of animals around there. And if the animals are thriving, they're mammals at Chernobyl. Why is radiation so dangerous? Why are the animals multiplying in areas that humans used to inhabit? Okay, clearly humans were more dangerous to animals than anything else. Chernobyl killed 31 people. Okay, the UN says 50 people. So you can pick a number, let's say 50 people. Let's compare it to natural gas. In 2004 in Algeria, in Skitka, Algeria, 27 people died from natural gas, 27 were injured, and 7 reported missing. The difference, however, is the natural gas industry responded proportionately. They did change their safety protocols to prevent this from happening again. But they didn't go bazookas like Japan did and shut down all their nuclear power plants for no reason whatsoever. Okay, and then become dependent on natural gas in the process. So there is something in the human condition that makes us very fearful of radiation. Japan could arguably have shut down the reactors that were close to Fukushima and on the far side of the island, but why did they shut all over the island? There was just appeared complete panic. So humans panicked themselves into the response. And the critiques against nuclear would tell you about if you take into account the cost from shutting down society, you've got $1 trillion risk, and no private investor will cover it. That's sort of what they would say. And that is what, if you challenge these regulations, that cost of the risk can come into proportion. Fukushima, for example, killed absolutely nobody, but people died of evacuation. Nobody died of radiation from Fukushima. They evacuated the entire population. My sister taught English to the children of Fukushima. They stigmatized kids for being radioactive at the time. If somebody is radioactive, he cannot give it to you. It's not witchcraft. It decays. You become less radioactive over time. There's nothing you can do it. And most of those kids probably weren't even radioactive. Okay, so they were traumatized. And now, this is the tragedy. If you look at when people died at Fukushima, died during evacuation. Nobody died from radiation. I would say there's a disclaimer, the Japanese government reimbursed one person. There's a law in Japan, if you can prove radiation caused cancer, they'll give you money. One guy has managed to prove it in court, but I'm not convinced by that case. But you can say maybe one person died of radiation at Fukushima. And Japan spent $200 billion upgrading all their plant safety in response to nobody dying. So you take $200 billion divided by 0, you've got the infinite cost to your risk. It makes no sense to me. Okay. This is another nuclear accident that is less known. It's Guyana, Brazil. At Guyana, Brazil, thieves stole medical equipment that were radioactive. And they were uneducated people living in the countryside of Brazil, didn't know what they were playing with. Pregnant women ingested it. They got contaminated inside, so it's ingestion, it's pregnant women. This is the ultimate test for medical safety, although obviously for ethical reasons you can't replicate it. And this was Dr. Wade Allison who investigated it, and this made him change his view, where he said both children were, so one woman was pregnant and one fell pregnant 5 months later. He said both children were measurably radioactive and yet reported to be doing fine. In the same way, the wildlife in Chernobyl is thriving because humans are gone and radiation isn't harming them at all. Okay, yet they evacuated the village. Nobody died. So we have to question it. And if you look at the amount of becquerel that they have, it's something like 1,000 to 10,000 times higher that you find in a fish at Fukushima. Okay, and yet people who ingested it, I mean, your test case shows you it did not happen. Okay, how did we come to accept the current fear of radiation? 1950s, General Eisenhower constituted the BEARS Committee. The BEARS Committee looked into radiation fallout over the United States because they were doing a lot of atomic bomb tests. And in particular, they were doing it in Nevada. The Mormon population in Utah next door had radiation clouds going over them with no shielding, no protection whatsoever. The Mormons have the least amount of cancer in the United States, okay, as population. The Genetics Committee unfortunately got staffed by geneticists funded by the rather ominous-sounding Rockefeller Foundation, and they lobbied for the safety regulations. It was the oil industry throwing money at their competition. I mean, this is nothing controversial that you would try and dunk your competition. And they basically lobbied for radiation to be as strict as possible, saying no dose ever. And then the industry came to adopt a standard known as ALARA, as low as reasonably acceptable. Okay, as low as reasonably achievable. So in other words, how low we can measure as opposed to how safe it is. And that is what principally resulted in the explosion of the costs. We have a regulation standard that is absurd. So if the committee in the official communications, and I did an interview with Dr. Edward Calabrese at Amherst, who's a top toxicologist who exposed this thing, it showed that in the official communications, they said that a few fruit flies have better data than the actual data from the atomic bomb survivors. And the data from the atomic bomb survivors actually show that for a certain threshold of radiation, it's not only not harmful, it's actually beneficial for you. Okay, so what does that do to your risk if it's beneficial? There's ethical questions to irradiating a population, but it might not do any damage to them at all. And what were the standards before ALARA? They accepted 100 millisieverts, which was the official standards. They increased the safety threshold by 1,000, okay, to 0.1. And since the 1950s, systematically, it's actually 71 when it really came into effect, radiation safety came to kill the industry. So we can go back to those costs that the Chinese and the Russians are building at. And most likely in practice, I won't be surprised if they are ignoring this, if they know this. Okay, but the democratic countries are running it. Article I recommend from Dr. Wade Allison, I won't read it now for the sake of time, is why we should stop running away from radiation. And he basically shows that the radiotherapist shoot people with higher doses of radiation over a more space time, so your body has time to heal. And because of that, we treat cancer. So radiation treats cancer, we know it. But yet, when it comes to nuclear safety, we assume it always causes cancer. And actually, it's hormetic. It is beneficial. So I tested this on theory myself. I went to Iran to not for nuclear weapons, but to actually go to the most radioactive natural radiation place in the world, where the background radiation is 250 millisieverts this year. I ate the apple from the forbidden fruit here. And you find nuclear plant safety is 10 millisieverts. You have a place in Iran that's 25 times higher. Okay.
What's the source of the natural?
It's radon coming up, okay, from igniferous rocks. So radon comes up, and then it's basically radon. This guy lives in a radioactive house, Yazdan Talishi. He's 80 years old. He grows narki trees there, and those narkis are delicious, okay. It's actually sour oranges, they call it naranji in version. But, even closer to home, I went here a few days ago. I went to Venda, to Chappies, for those who have been there. And Chappies is radioactive. I don't know if you know this. And why is that area so green? Okay, because there's natural radiation. Now, unfortunately, I can't get an estimate, and I don't have a Geico counter with me, and I would like somebody to go confirm this. But there is a study that I found where they estimated the geothermal potential of South Africa from background radiation. And yet, this is a holiday resort where we go to relax. We have warm baths, the Eiland. We are exposing ourselves to radiation, yet we're scared of it when it comes to nuclear power. We need to break that cognitive dissonance. So you have to ask yourself, why isn't Ramsar and Venda a toxic wasteland? Why is it actually green? Why isn't Chernobyl a wasteland? Why isn't Fukushima a wasteland? Why do the Germans go to hotspots? The medical aids reimburse them for that. Okay, and yet they shut down their nuclear power stations. And if Germany were to restart its power stations, it would cost $25 per megawatt hour, according to the study from the Radian Energy Group. That's cheaper than any renewable process source in Germany at the moment. Yet they go and dig out coal. Radiophobia can get a sophisticated, technological country like Germany to do something totally crazy. And here we have a good example of it. So what I propose for regulatory reform is a hormetic model, that we accept a certain threshold, a certain level is either okay or actually beneficial, and that we based our laws on that. And based on that, our costs will come into proportion. Makes complete sense. And you can actually expand this to all exposures. It will bring the cost of mining down, mine tailings, because, mine water, things in your borehole, there's arsenic here and there. Actually, a little bit of arsenic might even be good for you as well. I mean, it's completely impossible that one atom of arsenic is dangerous to you. So a certain level of any toxin, okay, can be good for you. And now I'm going to just prove to you signs of overregulation, since I'm also a little bit of a free market advocate. Usually mafias are a sign when you have overregulation. And there's actually a nuclear smuggling mafia that's connected, and they're smuggling nuclear waste across the world. Now, if waste was so dangerous, why can't the mafia figure it out? What is the mafia doing? And it happens that with Benjamin Netanyahu's current prison court case, is a little bit linked to the nuclear smuggling ring, So there's a bit of corruption in Israel as well because of this mafia. Then I'm just going to go here quickly to advanced reactors, just run quickly through your slides. This is a traditional pressure water reactor. Just to show the concept again, you've got a reactor that heats water in a primary loop. You've got a secondary loop that heats a turbine, the generator, then makes power. It's like a coal power station, except you've got nuclear as opposed to burning coal in a small reactor. The majority of the components in a nuclear plant is what you'd find at a coal plant. It's steel, it's concrete, all these things. Only the reactor might be a little bit of specialized equipment. So it's not even specialized skills. Just go the high temperature reactors that you've got gas-cooled. Pebble bed was one of these things. So as opposed to using water as a coolant, we use gas, helium or nitrogen or carbon. Can be used as gases, and they've got different applications. R&D still is required for this, unfortunately. I would say South Africa, there's a company, Strategic Global, they claim they can do it in 5 years in South Africa. My personal view is that all the technical questions were not solved with the pebble bed. Okay, it's still a good investment for the country, but we need to be honest about the R&D if we're going to ask for public money. Okay, molten salt reactors, the one I'm the most excited about, as opposed to they can go as low as 1 megawatt of electricity, so a community, a private investor can buy into them. Issue here is obviously corrosion. There's still R&D necessary with corrosion. But I would like to thank the wind and solar guys for something here, which is concentrated solar uses salt as a coolant, okay, as a storage technology, as a battery storage. Now, why can't I replace those solar panels with a little bit of liquid, with uranium and thorium salt? Then I've got a much cheaper solution to solve the battery storage problem. So nuclear can solve the battery storage problem if we invest into molten salt reactor. And this is the one I'm the most excited about. Then just China has its first pebble bed demonstrated, but it's not commercialized. It's not. They said it's a commercial reactor, but they are not selling it yet. So maybe they still have technical questions. And maybe South Africa can ask China with BRICS and things, what did you guys do? What did we lose? Can't we cooperate? Even the United States is doing it at the moment. Just startups in molten salt, Moltex, Seaborg, Copenhagen Atomics. I know a few South Africans actually working for them. And they claim by 2030 they can do it. When I ask them how much, they say it's about $1 billion necessary, and then we're done. And then just to show you the full thermodynamic potential of nuclear, it's not been fully exploded. If you look at light water reactors, if you take the energy out over energy in, now this is not an economist metric, it's an engineering metric, but the molten salt or the uranium or thorium salt has the potential of that 1 gram can replace 2 tons of oil. So significant R&D is still necessary in nuclear to try and get those technologies exploited and to bring it down to scale, because I think these big plants, especially in Western countries, they're tired of big investments and projects going over budget. I'm not against building them personally. I think South Africa should build 1 or 2 more, but I don't think we should go overboard with it. Okay, because I think there are risks involved. Just look at where nuclear has a business case, which countries are building. It tends to be countries that are developing countries with high youth unemployment. Okay, they need baseload capacity, that heretical word. And they have high levels of corruption, India, Egypt, Iran, Russia, and Turkey, surprisingly. And they tend to have electricity that's run by utilities as opposed to government. Okay, that's maybe against this organization. They also have very low energy usage per person. And if you look at the list of these countries, South Africa is almost on that list. Okay, so the business case for South Africa to build a nuclear power station is so obvious. Why are we always comparing ourselves to Europe and North America? We need to accept we're a developing country. We have the challenges of a developing world. We cannot escape the challenges of Africa. And all the countries with the same social economic conditions, same corruption level, same problems of inequality things, are building 1 or 2 nuclear reactors. They're also not going overboard with it. So I believe on that basis, it's a good judgment. I mean, it's not the only reason for it, but you can do it. Now you ask the question, could nuclear power help resolve South Africa's crisis? And I always cite this book by John Mearsheimer. It's actually in international law. It's about the lying in the international law. And, what amounts to the lesson of this book has been that even dictators like Putin and Xi Jinping are honest when they gamble with the future of their children. If Russia or China or America, whoever's going to build it fast, it's probably going to be their government pension money going to that reactor. Imagine you have to go and tell Putin and the KGB why this project overruns. Okay, this is going to be, the project will get done on time. And the advantage of what we call a vendor finance system is the person who builds it brings the money. So the construction risk has to be carried by the vendor. And if there's overruns and things and all these problems we face in France and the United States, it should not be South Africa's problem. We cannot absorb that risk. Okay, and fortunately, these countries are prepared to build under those conditions. They bring the wallet. And that, to me, makes it the investment case. Numerous countries are building under a vendor's financing system. It's Russia and China here. I think the UAE had a mixed system. They put some money down, but nonetheless, we can look at it. And the point I make is the construction risk must be shared between buyer and seller. If you do construction that way, the cost will come down. Generally speaking, 85% has to be from the builder. Okay, we will put 15% down. So the $1 trillion with 600 million, you must times that by 15%. That's what South Africa would have paid. Okay, it would have been far more affordable. If I look at South Africa at the moment, this is Eskom's data. It's from 2023, but I don't think beginning of this year. I don't think much has changed, to be honest. And if you look at it, we almost have as much capacity out of service as in service at the moment in Eskom. Okay. My solution in South Africa is fix the coal, okay? Scrap the environmental stuff and fix what is broken. We need 5 gigawatt to end load shedding. That's 2 or 3 power stations you need to fix. It's not a lot. And you need about 12 to 15 for your GDP growth to achieve it on par with other emerging markets. Yes, 1 or 2 nuclear power stations will help with that, but it's not going to solve the bigger picture. The bigger picture is this. Eskom is not doing maintenance. They're not managing properly. I'm personally against privatization at this stage, okay? And the reason is I think if we're going to have a shock like they had in the UK, given our geopolitical challenges in South Africa, with the shortage of electricity, I mean, obviously some of those assets are underperforming at the moment. I think you need to think of the geopolitical conflicts. You're going to create conflict and revolutions, potential for revolution. So either this private sector must slowly compete with Eskom, and we're seeing signs of that with wind and solar at the moment. But, rooftop solar in South Africa is only 4 or 5 gigawatt. Okay, that's a few stages of load shedding during the day. But we're sitting here today with stage 5, stage 6 load shedding. So my solution in South Africa is Eskom must come with a plan, issue bonds. I don't know how you're going to fit the financing. Private sector, I believe we need to allow Eskom to recapitalize, but they need to be properly managed and properly staffed. And I would say that's a short term before we move to the direction of privatization. I mean, in the long term, I agree, privatization might be a goal. In the short term, I'm a little bit skeptical of the proponents, okay? Is there political support in South Africa? Well, interesting enough, all the race groups show yes support, but the white population is split, and I have a suspicion that has to do with the Anglo-Boer War. Okay, if you go to the Afrikaans universities, historically speaking, they're in favor of nuclear, but then you go to the UCT, the guy who gets his lights from nuclear, they're opposed to it. I can't explain it, but if you look at all the race groups in the country, except the English-speaking whites, unfortunately, you find that there's overwhelming support for nuclear power. So it's a policy that will have support. Okay, and I write this article on the conditions that I would support it for. I write it to the minister in IOL. Should South Africa select a plant? We have all these factors to look at: cost, affordability, risks, scarce skills. Get those guys abroad to come back. Build a South Korean reactor if you want. Russian, I don't care, but get them to manage it. They will be loyal to the country. Desalination of seawater. South Africa ran out of water in 2008, I believe, for industrial purposes. We are load shedding and water shedding at the moment. You can use that rejected heat, that 2/3 of heat, for desalination. So your water theoretically costs nothing, or your electricity tariffs become cheaper. Kuberg only in 2018, I believe, looked at desalination. Since 1980. I mean, did nobody think that Cape Town would need water? Cape Town would not have had a water crisis if we just connected the desalination plant earlier. Basically, we can do it with the coal fleets as well. So you can solve electricity and water at the same time. But these solutions are not coming to the surface. I would argue intellectual support is necessary. Again, I'm citing UCT because they are the most, and UJ to some extent, and the Democratic Alliance. Why are they so hostile to a new nuclear technology? I don't understand it in a country without electricity. Okay. Diplomacy, I believe the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty of Pelindaba is important. So if we believe in international law, countries should not undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States is stationing weapons in Diego Garcia at the moment, which is a place that belongs to Mauritius. And they're undermining the Treaty of Pelindaba that South Africa signed to make Africa a nuclear weapons-free zone. Russia is involved in a war of aggression. They're not the only countries selling nuclear power. So why should we deal with countries that do not respect international law? Also, I believe design maturity, a plant that is approved, that has worked in another country, that's got spare parts, things of that sort, recent experience, track record, all the things that do it. And then do we have a strategy to counter the NGO industrial complex? Now, I'm not arguing for national intelligence or military intelligence to follow people, but when people deliberately disrupt the project, Earthlife Africa, okay, who lied about that $1 trillion thing, things of this sort, Greenpeace, what is our legal strategy? What is are we going to oppose it as a country? And saying, look, if the RFP comes out and the conditions are good, and South Africa does have the money, we build it, these guys should not be dictating terms for the entire country. I mean, there's a point for public participation, but there's also a point for them to realize that they do not control the country. Ultimately, the parliament makes laws and the government enforces it. The Minister of Energy, Gwedi Mantashe, is currently in favor of nuclear power. There's no secret about it. And look at the attack he's getting in the media, and look quickly at who's funding those people. I mean, I don't agree with him with a lot of things, but I think his instinct on nuclear is not wrong. And again, the IRP asks for 2.5 gigawatts. That's one power station. We're not saying let's build what France did in the 60s or 70s. So yeah, I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you.
All right, Hügo is going to take some questions. I'm going to take the first question, and then you will choose others. Hügo, if you can just elaborate a little bit on the safety issue.
Yeah.
So there was a popular TV series a while back, Chernobyl, and I think in the end credits it said something like, over the next 20 years or something, 6 or 60,000 people all across Europe died due to radiation exposure. Yeah. Now,
that's a complete. Okay, that's just a complete lie.
So how do they measure that? Where are these corpses, and are these real?
I'll explain to you. So first of all, I would like to find the corpses, if they can show me in the direction. Chernobyl, as far as we can tell, there's a good documentary called BBC Horizon that I can refer people to. It's BBC. Has, as far as we can tell, maybe 3,000 excess cancers was discovered in Chernobyl. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a population of 220,000. We don't know if that excess cancer is caused by radiation. Okay? Why? Because you're actively measuring everyone. Lots of people have cancer, we don't pick it up. So from the 3,000 up or down, you can pick a number. Let's say all of it is. Does that justify that documentary? Would just be a propaganda, let's be honest. If you look at the bombs, the atomic bombs, which is the best data you've got, because it's not nice saying it's 2 controlled experiments. Okay, only 9,000 people had cancer from Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Okay, those are 2 populations that were irradiated. There's no question about it. 100,000 people died from the explosion, yes. But the aftermath of the radiation is simply not as dangerous. And if you look at where they got radiation, it's those closer to the explosion, with the highest threshold. Yes, high threshold radiation will do that. But there's a certain threshold where there's just, if there's evidence, the French Académie des Sciences in 2006 came out with a report. Okay, they can send people if they're interested, where they said if there's evidence, it's within the noise, which is the best conclusion I can find. And we accept that type of risk for almost everything. Okay, we accept that if I eat breakfast in the morning, people have to deliver those products. We accept that within the noise, a truck driver will die. It's not nice to say it, but we accept a certain level of risk and death to get on with daily life. And the question about nuclear is, do we accept that risk or not? And that risk, when measured and compared to other risks, comes in, I think the death from nuclear is about the same as solar power. In wind, the wind industry alone in 2003 or 4 something, one of those dates, killed more people than Chernobyl, just by falling off wind farms, okay, the operators. So we are not comparing it rationally, we are reacting emotionally. The Chernobyl documentary was a good documentary, but it's pure propaganda. And you can look, Dr. Calvin Kim wrote an article on this, I believe it was on WhatsApp with that, is the website, if I'm not mistaken in a moment, where it just showed that the way they showed radiation deaths, things of that medical stuff just did not occur. So that's part of the stuff that needs to be exposed. Yes.
So I just want you to clarify something for me. You know, you've got the cheaper producers, China, Korea, India. How much of that is...
Sorry, Nancy, can you speak into the microphone so people on YouTube can hear?
Okay, how much of that cheaper production, down to $2,000, etc., is from different standards being applied? I mean, you talk about the radiophobia, and you know maybe a 40-meter concrete surrounds of in the USA, and which is obviously not necessary. I mean, is it a standard-related thing, or are they just better at spending the money? So that's the one question. And the other question is, when you talk about we should build something, what sort of size plant should we build? I mean, what is a good size plant to build? Because there's a lot in the press also about these small things you can put on the back of a flatbed truck. In the USA, they're doing research, and I don't know whether Musk's into it, but some other people are, and then we can go to a small town, Bethlehem or something, and park one of these things there, and you don't have to have transmission problems and all that. So if you can just comment on that stuff, thank you.
Okay, so it's not just radiophobia and the linear no threshold. Yeah. That is what drove the fear in the United States. But that wasn't just a safety standard being applied in terms of you need to build a thicker slab of concrete. It created a popular culture that was resistant towards it. And that made them not build 3 plants in consecutive order to get the economies of scale. And it's actually economies of scale that drives the cost. Okay, so in India, I think they're building 10 plants. You just get very good at something if you do it 10 times over. Same plant, same design. The US also kept on changing their design, which is just a stupid way of building.
So
standardization.
We could set the standards, whatever we're happy with. I suppose they're international nuclear standards.
Yes.
And they could build it cheaper if you give them 3 plants.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you build it, you just say you come and build a plant that's been approved by your regulator.
Yeah.
Okay, and we want it at that cost that you're building, at $3,000 per kilowatt of electricity. That's what I want the plant to cost in South Africa. And if there's overruns, it's your problem, not my problem. I mean, that's how you build your house, right? Yeah. That's how you build. So the contractual agreements are very important. On your question on what I call small modular reactors, I use the term advanced reactors or generation 4 reactors. I don't like small modular as a term because they're not all modular. Okay, some things you still build on site. There's only one in commercial operation, maybe 2. You can argue Russia put a submarine one on a boat, okay, which doesn't sound very innovative to me. And then China's got that pebble bed thing. There's not one in the market being sold by a vendor at the moment. So yes, to your point, if they come into commercial production within the next few years, they're 100 megawatt, 150, 300, France has got a 350. They're all over the place. NASA's talking about 10 megawatt. I'm all for it. It's just something you need to take into account, which I caution people against, the smaller reactors. Larger reactors tend to be better in efficiency. And smaller reactors have an issue where the amount of enriched uranium goes up. Okay, submarine reactors are enriched to 60%. So you're going to face issue with the non-proliferation treaty. And that's international law. So I'm not against them, just the right conditions. Okay, and is that something South Africa should gamble our money away in a crisis? I don't think so. So I know there's people who say they can build a pebble bed. And if the government wants to start a research program for that purpose to help them and to get us commercialized again, I'm all for it. But that's not going to solve Eskom's problems. Okay. In terms of what the size you need, you asked, there's 1,200 megawatts on scale. I think you can go 1,800 to 900 megawatts. That's what the IRP says. I personally would not go bigger than that at the moment. I actually thought Zuma's 9.6 megawatt was good for a long-term strategy as energy mix. Okay, but the IRP is now going to be approved, or has been approved by Parliament. I would not change the law. Just say we accept the 2.5. And remember, that's only 2 stages of load shedding. It's not going to solve the bigger picture, but it will help. It will help a little bit, you know.
Is this on now?
Yeah, it's fine. Can I just discuss? It's off now. Just press it again.
Hello? On?
Yeah.
Can I just discuss your view on privatization? at the moment, I mean, you say you don't think that privatization would be a good idea for Eskom. Then you put a little in parentheses, you say, but they must just be well managed and well maintained. Well, we're here because they're not well managed and they're not well maintained. The only way you're going to get them well managed and well maintained if you do get the private sector involved. And it's no good saying, here's our utopia if they do that. We know with 110% certainty they're not going to do that. You're never going to get Eskom to do that. So to me, the only solution is to sell off every single power station, whether it's for R1 or R1 million, whatever, put it out to tender, sell the grid. You can get quite a few R1 billion for that, which would help to pay off some of the debt, and sell off the distribution centre as well. I mean, sell off everything. There's nothing that needs to be run by the government whatsoever. And so that would be, I think, the part of the solution. The other part of the solution is what's happening now. I'm prepared to put a cup of coffee on a bet with you that within 2 years' time we won't have any load shedding because South Africa has deregulated energy and therefore the private sector is providing it. So we have privatization in that way as well. So I mean, I just like, by the way,
I'm in favor of the private sector competing against Eskom, which is what's happening now. Okay, the private sector was not allowed to compete because there was a capacity cap. I'm all in favor of what's happening now. Why? What I caution, I would hope that what's going to come out of this policy, which I think is one of the best policies South Africa's had, not because the government wanted to, they were forced into it, let's face it, is I hope Eskom would be more performant. I don't know if that's going to happen. I would perform better. Okay. Why I'm worried about it is this. I followed the Russian-Ukraine war very closely. Okay. The run-up to that war started when the IMF imposed what was called structural reforms on Ukraine to privatize the energy infrastructure. I take the view, and that allowed for the resentment to take place in the Donbass region, and then the rest is history. The coup d'etat, all those things are history. The backdrop of that was done by a privatization not thought through. Okay, very well. Now, again, I would like to happen systematically. If the government, as now, the government systematically, the private sector is climbing in, and they might even be eating Eskom's revenue, and Eskom now has to perform or they will die a slow death. I'd let them die a slow death as opposed to doing it abruptly. Why? During the apartheid years, okay, Eskom became part of what was called the grand strategy, the total strategy of South Africa. That's why we have a cooperative agreement with Lesotho. We sell them electricity. There's a hydroelectric dam downstream. They give us water. If they turn off the tap, we turn off the lights. It was a policy of nuclear deterrence based on the work of a Frenchman by the name of André Beaufret, that's Magnus Malan and P.W. Boetalred. And that's why we have and the idea was that we force people into cooperation. So we have Eskom's infrastructure placed to solve geopolitical conflicts in South Africa. It was done so in Mozambique as well with Cabora Bassa. There's a two-way agreement. And my only concern is when you privatize too fast, what is going to happen with these historical conflicts? Do you think those people there are just going to roll over and they're going to accept structural reforms or going to get angry? I'd rather let Eskom die a slow death, or even better, they realize they can now cooperate with the private sector and they can be run like the Krüger National Park, which seems to be forced into competition, is actually performing quite well. So I'm not against privatization. It's not misunderstand me. It's an approach to get there, because I'm really worried about what happened in other countries when they did it the wrong way. And often what you find with privatization, it becomes a word that is thrown around so that middlemen can climb in while the state underwrites their risk of investment. That's not privatization, that's rent seeking. Okay, and I would bet good money that that's what the ANC will do. Okay.
So you're just making the privatization process more sophisticated. I'm happy to do that. Yeah. I'm just saying that the end goal, in my view, and it seems like your view, is privatization. You know, we can go there different routes and we can protect certain agreements and so on. That's not a problem.
States as national utilities competing against the private sector, and some of the best performing utilities are the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Hoover Dam. And they're doing very well as nationalized utilities in the US. But they know if they don't perform, they're out of business tomorrow, even with bailouts. Okay?
Can I just stretch it a little bit further?
Yeah.
I think I would like to give some others
just one little bit. Why should the government ever have got involved in energy? That's a big. I mean, is there any reason why the private sector could not do that from word go?
Yeah, sure.
Quite a few questions. And if I could just ask everyone to introduce themselves when they ask their question. Thank you.
Okay, so just quickly answer that. Governments tend to have, whether you agree with it or not, 3 priorities in energy. Energy security, they would go to war over energy. We've seen wars over energy. Then what they call energy access to all equity, price, things of that sort. And the third one is environmental stuff. And government policymakers always see it that way. Why they should do it that way, why they can't let the private sector run it like a free market utopia, I don't know. But that is the policy framework that we all live with and work with. And there's no ways I'm going to be able to talk Gwedi Mantashe out of that. Okay, so I accept the world for what it is. Okay, whether it can work theoretically or not, there are examples, I agree, of countries, but they tend to be small islands and small places. Large countries, the governments tend to always go into the energy markets. So I go for the best of both worlds, which is to say, let the government compete against the private sector. Okay, so it's a question of realism, to be honest. Yeah.
Hügo, thanks very much. Mark McLeod from Harmer and Courts Impact. I think the point you're making on privatisation, you sound like you're in favour of PPPs, public-private partnerships, which I think Anthony would be forced to speak about. The comment you made about the cultural split of the sector and the white sector specifically, do you think that's because of a similar fear over the points of service, maintenance, engineering concerns, and then it's been the icing on the cake is all the radiophobia. So perhaps there's a split there that's more based on a concern about what we've seen has developed and it's paranoia around nuclear.
Yeah.
Particularly the generation from Cold War era and things.
Well, I just find it very... I struggle to explain it because I don't think the Afrikaans-speaking whites are even... I think they're as skeptical as the English-speaking whites of the government, okay, in South Africa. If I look at it from a historical perspective and from the media, I think it has much more to do with the media. The English-speaking media fearmongers watch more. They just fearmonger more about radiation. I mean, look at the Karoo. They've got that solar potential in the Karoo of all those suppliers theoretically. They haven't built the transmission lines yet. Now that is an underperforming government. If you made that critique against Kuberg, I would say yes, they are late with the repairs now and all these things. They're very bad at that. So they're not bad at it, but they're not performing as well as they should be. But you can make it with coal. But with nuclear, it's as if there's an extra cherry on top, and it tends to be the English-speaking media that adds it. I mean, there's no critique you can label against nuclear that you can't label against coal. In fact, Kuberg is the best performing plant in South Africa. Okay, and one reason for that is there's international law and compliance coming on top of it. So that might keep the ANC a little bit more honest. I don't know. It's worth asking the question. I just, it's what I see in the data.
But we could assist in that through the
Yeah,
conversation.
sure.
Final point, regarding water, you made points to do desalination would then improve. But we have a water gap that we know of. Are you clearly saying that nuclear would help us bring down that water?
Yeah, so if you look at South Africa's water problem, generally speaking, Johannesburg is one of the largest cities in the world without a large lake and things. So we have water from Lesotho, and at the moment what's happening over the gradual pace is our coastal cities are dragging down the inland rivers. So if the coast has more water, the inland rivers can recover. So that's basically it, yeah.
Good. My name is Marcus. You were talking about 3 bills in a program to bring the cost down, vendor finance hopefully. But how big would each of those 3 units be?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what you see empirically in the data is something like a 900 megawatt, 1,200, 1,500. I would argue if they go bigger than those units, they overshoot. And we saw that with the European pressure water reactor. Okay, that was probably too big. So I would say India is doing 900s, and they seem to be getting the best performance of all of them. I think China's building 1,200, and so is Russia. So that's more or less the range. Yeah.
Okay, so it's about 1,000.
Thank you very much for the talk. I want to know if you do a mega analysis, you take the cost, the possible environmental consequences, the possible health consequences on the population, the waste that will be generated, and the long-term effect of that waste, which as far as I remember you haven't discussed. How do we get rid of that waste other than burying it underground? And how safe is that waste there that future generations are not going to be exposed to it? So if you do a mega analysis like that, can you, in all honesty, say that nuclear is cheaper than renewables?
Yes. So if you look at the linear no threshold, it assumes no dosage of radiation will ever be safe. Okay, that is the current safety standards. Under those standards, the answer to your question is no. Under the current standards, why? Because we assume that waste will never get to a safe level. But waste decays. Waste runs at a negative interest rate. Okay, so if you can get other countries, we have a facility at Valpits in the Karoo. We're one of the few countries with a facility. We put it in the middle of a desert. No environmentalist wants to protest there. The water table is 1 kilometer below ground level. There's no risk of corrosion. It's the ideal place to put it. It's better. It's much safer than mine tailings. But you get to a point where the waste will decay over a long period of time to a safety level, if we accept there's a threshold. But because we accept there's no threshold, the waste never gets safe. So what is the solution to waste? Put it in a hole in the ground and leave it there for a few hundred or 1,000 years, and it gets to a point where it is safe. And you can play with that waste after a few years. The highest range of waste is within the 30 to a few hundred years, because it's a decay constant. Okay? I think strontium or something, there's one of them that's maybe 100 or 200 years. But afterwards, you get to a certain level where it generates mostly heat. And if you really want to be stupid enough to go and play in a waste treatment facility, I mean, I can't do it. What we do with high-level waste at Koeberg is we weld it shut in a dry car storage, which weighs 200 tons. You cannot steal that and put it in the boot of your car. Okay, there's nothing you can do about it. So the waste issue is a strange one to me, because in my view, it's relatively solved. You put it in a hole in the ground and you just wait it out.
What's the scale of that?
All Koeberg's waste thus far is not even half a tennis court, and most of the waste is not even storage. Now compare that to mine tailings. We have mine tailings, we have mine dams, tailings that we're still managing from Paul Kruger's time. But no, this is just an acceptable risk for the society.
I've got a follow-up here. I'm still a bit confused. You know, you say you're going to put in a 1.2 plant. Are these standards that you have to specify international? You know, I'm still coming down to that cost. You know, that the Indians can build it for 3,000 and the Americans will build it for 13,000. Is it the same standards that you're specifying, or is it just that they build better if you give them 3 plants to build, or are you specifying different standards?
At the moment, China in the export market, China is building in Pakistan for 2,000. So I'm saying, China, you build one in Pakistan for 2,000. I want one for that price in South Africa.
Will it meet the standard?
Yeah. What?
But are the standards in Pakistan the same as the standards in America?
Yes.
That's
Yeah, you've got international law coming onto it. Look, countries have their own nuclear regulator, and theoretically they can deviate from the norms.
Okay.
But by and large, they copy and paste.
All right, so that's it. The norms are pretty international.
Yeah, they're pretty.
Okay, so there you answer my question.
Okay.
Thanks. My name is Tapelo Mutsudi. And in the interest of full disclosure, from 2016 up until last week Thursday, I was the chairperson of the National Nuclear Regulator. And so I'm free now to speak without feeling constrained. So I'm not constrained by the position that I held for the last few years. So, you know, you said a lot of things, and I made quite a lot of notes. I won't get into all of them because I'll monopolize the conversation. But I'll just touch on a few. But before I say that, I just want to, you know, just as an answer to the question that you asked, Mr. McClue, all the high-level waste that's been produced at Koeberg since it started is on site. That's how legal it is. So I just needed to put that out there. But, you know, as a bit of background, I happen to be a radiologist by profession, and I've got a background in nuclear medicine. So some of the things that you said about radiation homeostasis, I disagree with, because it's certainly not consensus within the medical community about the benefits of radiation, at least in the way that you've outlined it. And we can have a discussion offline about it. But before I ask the question that I need to ask, I just need to acknowledge your wife, who you said is from Iran. I happen to have been there at the IAEA when the JCPA was discussed after the US pulled out of it during Donald Trump's tenure. And of course, there was a lot of propaganda around it, and those in the know are familiar with the background to what happened there. And the second thing is I need to acknowledge what you said when you started about the trillion rand deal. It's the most incredible, successful, I have to add, propaganda in this country. I've asked so many people whether they're in the Daily Maverick or 702, all the opinion makers in this country to give me the source of this trillion rand, and they've been unable to do so, simply because it doesn't exist. But we can even take it a step further and ask about the nuclear deal that's been signed with Russia. The source of that information and where that deal is supposed to mean, because what we have done as a country, we've signed cooperative agreements with a number of countries. The US, South Korea, China, and Russia being one of them. But because of the geopolitics around nuclear, Russia was isolated, and that's what the Mail and Guardian ran with for many, many years. That's what the particularly English-speaking media, and I'm glad you alluded to the differences of opinion in South Africa. So I'm glad that you have acknowledged the geopolitics around nuclear, because, I always say to people, when you approach nuclear, you have to understand that there's a science which is indisputable, but there's ideological, philosophical positions that people have about it, and that influences how they perceive the science, which is supposed to be the other way around. The science is supposed to be to influence our perceptions and our views about the world. So, I don't wanna, get it. Like I said, I've made a lot of notes about the things that you've said, but I just want to highlight two things, or at least, and then ask one question. Firstly, I disagree with you that Russia putting a small reactor on a ship is unimpressive. I actually see it the other way around. I think it's an example of that. It's actually a perfect example that you can do this on a small scale. I mean, to put it on an icebreaker, because that's what they're doing in Siberia. They've put these on icebreakers, and they're working very well. So for me, it's proof that it can work. Instead of using the Turkish thing, the car power ship. Exactly, it's the same principle. You can actually have a ship, anchored in Cape Town or in Durban, connected to the grid and providing us with clean power. Now, I use the word clean carefully here, because as a regulator, I could not afford to be seen to be promoting nuclear. I'm supposed to be impartial. But the truth is that the science speaks for itself. Whether you are a regulator or you're a promoter of nuclear in Nexa or at Quebec, you have to follow the science. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing that I needed to push back on, I've already alluded to the radiation hormesis part. I think sometimes nuclear proponents, in their eagerness to promote nuclear, oversell this idea of radiation being beneficial. I think the jury's still out on that. And I think in the absence of definitive evidence, it's just best to err on the side of caution. And that's why even I, as a radiologist, I wear a lead shield when I walk into a CT scan room, to do a whole body scan. That's why a radiation oncologist, just like we do, will carry dosimeters to measure the radiation. Simply because you're correct, the linear threshold model there's very little science to back it up. But equally, there's very little science as well on the other side, on the extreme end, to say, yes, you can definitely benefit from having radiation. So, but I mean, like I said, I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion about it. We can have a talk about that later. Lastly, Mantashe. I think it's unfair to say that Mantashe is pro-nuclear or pro-coal or pro. He's not. What Mantashe is pro is government policy. Government policy is very clear. Nuclear is part of the energy mix. And so a role of a government minister is to push what the cabinet has approved. Now, if our president or other government ministers are too weak and are too afraid of standing out on a public platform to speak the truth, that's their problem. And Mantashe clearly is able to draw the negative media attention because he's called a dinosaur. But all he's doing is pushing government policy, which the president is supposed to actually be the one doing it as well, but he's not. for reasons that are best known to many people. But anyway, last point, and I'll hand over to you. Like I said, I've made a lot of notes, so I'll take some of these offline. The last thing that I wanted to say is that I want to get your view on fusion, particularly because you said you worked at ITER. And I've been following what has been happening there. I've even had a meeting with Spencer Pitcher, who you might be familiar with. Now, in the skeptic community, we always say that fusion is always 30 years away. But the fusion proponents are always telling me that it's 5 years away. So I'm keen to hear what you have to say about that.
Question, as an engineer, I like what works. Okay, ITER was an excellent project to work at. Okay, I loved it, intellectually challenging. The challenge in nuclear is not the fact that there's infinite energy. We all know that. Okay, it's the materials. You need to make those materials for those heat and for those things, and they are a major challenge to develop. So R&D is still necessary, and I think 20 years is even optimistic. That being said, the cost to finish ITER is like 2 or 3 months of the war in Afghanistan. Okay, so a better allocation, government's better for allocating resources. Okay, this is a good example. The United States, if they want to, can. I was there at ITER, and the U.S. Army was there if they should give money. And one guy asked us, "Is there any military applications?" And they said no, and it's like, well, you're not going to get money. Okay, it's beyond absurd that the U.S. spends so much money on its military. And a better allocation of resources can at least prove it to work. I mean, we have JET in the UK, which you'll be familiar with. JET got to a Q factor, I think it was 0.7, which is energy in out. They almost beat the 1 threshold mark. ITER theoretically is a higher version of a magnetic confinement thing. Theoretically it works. The scientists, they all tell me it will work. It will get to 6, maybe not 10, that they're aiming for 10. I would like to see it work. And I do think it can work, it can do, but you need money for it. And it is unfortunate that those guys have to beg for money every time. Donald Trump, to his credit, signed a blank check. He just didn't even know what he was signing. But that's the problem. They have to go beg every now and then for money. And I would like to see ITER being completed to see if it works, and because we need engineers and scientists to play with it, to see what the parameters are before we can get it to mass production. So that's my view on ITER. If we can get the money for it, it can be done in a reasonable period of time, but there is still significant R&D involved. Okay. On your point on Hormesis, yeah, I acknowledge there's a debate in the literature. I'm just saying that let's go back to the standards we had, at least for accidental cases, okay, before the 1950 Bayes Commission, okay. And what I would argue is, even if we keep linear no threshold, ask what threshold, what is the actual cost of the risk, okay? What is the money cost? Risk is probability times, cost, okay? That is the risk. So we need to really reassess the risk of accidental cases, because I do think that calculation, that 1 trillion or the money Japan's thrown around, does not make sense to me. So even if even if I know radiologists have been, actually geneticists have been pushing back against it the most, but I know some radiologists are. So I acknowledge there is some debate on that issue. I'm personally convinced. I've gone through the literature. Obviously, I'm not a medical person, but I've interviewed Dr. Wade Allison and Edward Calabrese and all these health physicists on the subject. Okay. I can't remember all your other points, but yeah, on Gweri Mantashe, I completely agree. At this stage, I will say it in public, in terms of energy policy, I'd rather vote for the ANC than the DA, in terms of energy policy. The Democratic Alliance is totally with Kevin Milhelm and these guys, and I've even spoken to him, it's no secret, he knows it. You have to argue 3 hours with them to get them to accept nuclear. And they say to me, I'm not anti-nuclear, but, okay? No, you're anti-nuclear, I'm sorry.
They work.
I know, I don't know what the issue is. I just think it's, I don't second judge somebody's motives, but I just say the DA has got a stance of energy mix that makes no sense to me. Okay, and it's probably the fear narrative. The Western Cape gets 40% of its energy from nuclear, and they're the party that's against it. It makes no sense to me. Right.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. Good, that was a very a great talk, and I think we invited you to talk about nuclear, but I think you've given us actually a very nice overview of energy in general, making the point about fossil fuels also being a necessary part of the whole mix, at least for another few decades. And we are at the FMF, we're energy agnostic. So I think personally, I like how nuclear sounds, but ultimately we should go where the market takes us. And if allowed to, the market will very, very likely include nuclear, but also renewables and fossil fuels, as you alluded to. Everything has a place. I want to thank you again on behalf of the FMF. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. I know it's a smaller crowd than usual, and we apologize again for the kind of impromptu nature of this event, but we think it is nice that we, instead of a webinar, got together here in person. I think Hügo will be available for a few minutes afterwards for some offline conversations. There's still some cheese and wine in the hallway, so please stick around. And yes, we have something to hand over to Hügo as well.
Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking Hügo for his talk again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.